inclusion, universal access, and meaningful connectivity. To take us through this particular session is a gentleman who is a telecommunications engineer with over 15 years of experience in the multidisciplinary telecoms industry with skills and strength in internet public policy development, government engagement, as well as project and operations management. He is a Bachelor of Science degree holder in computer science and technology and has an MBA in strategic management. He is also a certified project management professional and a certified Cisco network associate. It doesn't get better than that, from business to project management and also to networking. This man, he is the Senior Manager Stakeholder Engagement at Eastern and Southern Africa at the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And one thing you should know about him, he is passionate about mentoring the young people. Up next is none other than Bob Ochieng. Welcome, Bob, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and great to be here. You know, another edition of the Kenya IGF, and I want to welcome all of you, you know, from wherever you are joining us to this particular session, and I do look forward to a really engaging session. This one is about inclusion, and we're actually going to make it very inclusive. So from the very onset, I want you to know that it is your questions, you know, your comments that I'll be looking forward to in the next 45 minutes. My name is Bob Ochieng, and I'm being joined by, you know, an eminent panel that will take us through discussions around inclusion, universal access, and meaningful connectivity. We can't have internet without inclusion, without universal access, without meaningful connectivity. You know, there can be connectivity, but then there is meaningful connectivity. There is a difference. And to help us navigate, you know, this interesting sub-theme around this year's theme is an eminent panel, which shortly I'll ask to introduce themselves in no particular order before we start. And just for housekeeping purposes, I'll ask my panel to please keep their interventions in under 2 minutes, so that we actually have a lot of time for our audience to do engage with us. So without much further ado, let me now hand it over to my panel in no particular order to please introduce themselves very briefly before we start. So my first panelist to introduce herself will be our High Commissioner, the Deputy High Commissioner. Josephine, please, if you can. Josephine, if you can hear me, please introduce yourself very briefly. Okay, as we sort out that technical challenge, I can't hear her. Joel, please.
Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure. Proceed.
Good. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, because I'm sure we have an international audience with us. My name is Joel Karobio, the CEO of Kenya Network Information Center, and just briefly who Kenya Information Center is. We administer and manage the top-level country code, which is the .ke in Kenya. And our purpose, because we always have to have a purpose in terms of what we do, is to provide a secure and accessible and reliable .ke internet ecosystem, which is the sort of like the gateway of the internet. If someone wants to get on the internet, they must have a DNS name, and that's what we do. So we are the custodians of the .ke, and proud and happy to be at the KIGF 2021. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Joel. Josephine, please.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, everyone, from wherever you're joining. I'm Josephine Miliza. I work with the Association of Progressive Communications, a local access network project hosted by Kixanet. That's quite a mouthful, but very happy to be here to be part of these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mugambi?
Hello, everyone. My name is Mugambi Kiai. I'm the Regional Director for Article 19 Eastern Africa. Article 19 Eastern Africa is a freedom of expression, freedom of information, global non-governmental organization. And its name is derived from Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Thank you very much, gentlemen and lady, and warm welcome to this session. So very quickly, I want us to just have a round of comments on a few questions that we'll be starting off with. But again, before we start, I think the Deputy High Commissioner has joined us. So Josephine, if you could just do a brief introduction, then we proceed. Thank you. Just introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Josephine Gould. I'm the British Deputy High Commissioner here in Kenya.
Thank you. And just picking it from where you left it, so I want us to have a quick kind of comments or submissions onto a set of questions that we'll be tackling today before I hand it over to the audience. So I want to invite the Deputy High Commissioner to, very briefly talk about what can be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, context in terms of relationship between digital inequality and social economic rights. Your comments, please, Josephine.
It's a really huge topic. I think that the pandemic has brought so much home to us about how it was relatively easy for those of us with good access. We've seen our children could continue with their education, and those without, in Kenya, in the UK, around the world, really started to fall behind. We saw those differences really come to the fore. Here we've been involved in some studies looking at some of the effects of the pandemic on learners with disabilities, because social distancing even was a problem perhaps for them to have access, to be able to kind of access the technology or their places of learning. So lots of the just lots of sort of small factors I think were having a huge impact on people's abilities and just creating bigger gaps.
Thank you very much. I do pick, a very important, element of what you just mentioned there about access to education and how COVID actually disrupted that and how technology was very critical in making that happen. There are those who could do that. There are those who could not, as a result of technology. I'm not sure if, your namesake Josephine also wants to, just touch on that a bit in the context of COVID, the relationship between digital inequality and social economic rights. Melissa.
Thank you, Bob. And just to add to my namesake's point is that I think for me was the bringing forward of the importance of everyone's participation in terms of supporting themselves. We came face to face with the fact that actually Nairobi can be locked and we are not able to move. And so when so many of our digital infrastructure, especially the support aspects, are located in cities, it becomes very challenging for people living in rural areas to get support during the pandemic. So for me, what it brought forward is the enabling of local capacities. We need to build capacities at the local level so that people are able to know whether it's support themselves in terms of providing connectivity or creation and localization of content. There was a lot of using of digital platforms to disseminate information about COVID. And we saw that in most instances, it was mostly maybe in Kiswahili or English. And so we also need to enable capacities at local level so that we are able to create content that is relevant both in terms of context and languaging. So I would say those were some of my takeaways from the pandemic.
relevant content, local content. Coming to you, Joel, and you sit at KENIC, and you play a critical role, in bringing the Kenyan nation online. How has COVID impacted this? And from where you sit, how do you, support, digital inclusivity? Because we are talking about inclusion here. How does .ke play a role in all this, in ensuring that, there's digital, Kenyans can go online, can access the internet from wherever they are?
Thank you, Bob. Obviously, as you rightly said, we as the gateway to the internet in Kenya have, when with the advent of the pandemic, then it called upon us to look at our business differently. It called upon us to start asking, how can we do things better? And I'll pick to what my other two colleagues have talked about. And I think a good case study is the education sector, where now you find that schools are closed and people cannot then have physical learning. And we saw then there was an inequality, as you've rightly asked. What was that inequality? Because some of us then were able to join online classes. There were Zoom calls happening all over the place, but there was a larger constituent that did not have these opportunities. And with that, then we asked ourselves, how do we change this? Because I'm sure some of us on this call know that our children or our relatives then had to be held back for a whole year of class, which they've lost because of lack of connectivity or lack of online learning at that point. But as KENIC, then what happened at that point is we partnered with some of our local registrars, and we started looking at aspects of where the USF fund can come in. And some of our partners started doing connectivity in schools, and we partnered with those schools then to give them that online presence and a platform where then students can be able to access digital education. They can have a learning platform where they're able to then just have an opportunity to continue learning during that pandemic. But as I said at the very beginning, then this was only to a certain number of people, because we are still looking at that last mile connectivity in terms of how many people still have access to internet connectivity. But even at the back end, how many even people still have access to electricity to be able to have that connectivity? So as KENIC, one of the things that we are looking at is, how do we just get people online? How do we get people to interact online, whether it's through their e-commerce platforms or pretty much just from an education sector, how are they able to access information more? So as Josephine too has mentioned, content is something that is quite critical for us. And you're seeing a lot of people are coming up with content now. So I think, Bob, just to start off, there's a lot that can be done in the online space. And as KENIC, we are critical in terms of ensuring that people have a secure and accessible online presence to be able to do some of those things. Thank you.
Secure and accessible online presence. Interesting that this panel is today 50-50, very balanced. I think we need some credit to that, to the organizers for really working and ensuring that we have a very balanced panel. I want to go to, I believe, the only learned friend in the panel. Some of us are merely educated. So we want to get an intervention from a learned position. Mugambi, I know you talk about legal stuff, but interestingly today, the law and technology is really at crossroads. There's a lot of law, almost everything has a legal consideration, be it data, be it everything you do today in technology. Legal is now part and parcel of it. So from a regulatory perspective, what are the relevant regulatory issues that you'd say require attention today, that would enhance inclusivity and access to digital, to the digital economy? What needs to be done from a regulatory perspective? What are we not getting right? How can we get human rights right if we were to actually fully embrace, the potential of the digital ecosystem or digital economy that we have?
Thank you. Actually, you want to start exactly where your question ended, with the question of the internet as a highway that is part of what we call the commons. The commons is the space where we all share and we all come together. And even before you talk about regulation, you're going to start thinking about it as part of a paradigm of rights. What this means is that it falls squarely within our constitutional framework. Our constitutional framework obligates all of us in terms of the principles of governance, in terms of our values, under Article 10 of the Constitution, to look at questions of equity, inclusiveness, and when you look at the Bill of Rights, from Article 19 all the way to Article 59, you will note two things about this space. One is that when we talk about the internet, foundationally it is premised on the freedom of expression, on the freedom of information, which run between Articles 33 to 35 of the Constitution. As I said, under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that's Article 19, and under the African Charter on Civil and on Human and People's Rights, that's Article 9, if I'm not wrong. What the freedom of expression does, it has two roles. One is it is conclusive. It protects, promotes your right to speak, communicate, share ideas with each other. And that is just a protected right. The second one, of course, is that it is facilitative. It means that you can offer the freedom of expression to connect people. So in that sense, that is a foundational space that we then will look at the internet and say, is it fulfilling that role? That's the first one. Secondly, we then say, is it protecting equity? Is it protecting dignity? Is it protecting inclusivity? And some of the key things we look for are, if you talk about inclusiveness, you must talk about accessibility. You must talk then about, is the infrastructure there? Has it been put there? And a lot of this will come back to what we saw as the early conversations in the 60s around what they call the democratic developmental state, where the state has an obligation to not just enhance democracy, but also promote and defend development. And the internet squarely falls there now because it is part of what I said, called the commons. So issues, for example, around healthcare, around education, around environment, that's part of our commons. It's part of our shared territory. And that one then, before you talk about regulation, you talk about, so what rights accrue to individuals, to groups, to different formations, before we then talk about regulation, because regulation then talks about limitations. How do we then limit? What are the principles, even before you talk about limitations, what are the principles that any state or any entity is entitled to before you limit rights? And I think some of these are some of the gray areas. I see it as a work in progress. We're not going to get it first time right. COVID hit us, essentially in February, March 2020. So I think there's a learning curve about how we talk about ensuring that the internet is inclusive, yet that questions of hygiene, because if the internet is not sanitary, then people will start leaving that, will start ceding that space. If people don't have, it's not affordable, people will not access the internet. If people don't have the capacity or the knowledge for it, there'll be a problem. So coming from a rights paradigm, I think there needs to be thinking, and actually my own invitation and my own challenge here is that groups like Article 19 needs to really collaborate a lot more with groups like Kichtenet to develop a rights paradigm that allows us to do the two things. One of which is to protect and promote freedom of expression, but the other is to create and protect issues of equity, issues of inclusivity, issues of equality. I think that some of these are some of the questions that before we flesh out what needs to be done, I think we need to have a real think through about the principles that must govern this. And I think we will need to borrow a lot from international protocols, international charters, international ideas, but also our own very thought-provoking and and innovative thinking around what must be done. And you know, lastly, let's talk about content creation. You know, that's part of inclusivity, that I should be able to create content and put it on the internet. Yet in Kenya, there seems to be a problem, for example, between some content that is then termed as immoral. Yet under Article 33(2), there is a right to artistic creativity. So when, for example, Eric Omondi gets into trouble with certain statutory authorities, you begin to ask, how does that affect inclusivity for people who need to harness or consume his products? When we talk about the education sector, you know, is a school in Maralal or Turkana, does it have the same access? And we're seeing these conversations around even the competency-based curriculum on some of the tasks parents are being given. You know, you're told to print. How many teachers in Kibra, parents in Kibra have printers, or even are near cyber cafes that can print? So the ideas are good. Let's not be fuzzy about that. The ideas are actually good. The question is, when you look at it from the situation of inclusivity, the parents in Kilimani will have a better chance of facilitating their children than the ones in Kibra. And we must have that conversation, because then when we talk about then the digital divide and the fourth industrial revolution, how does it affect people in the different spaces and the different contexts and circumstances they're in? I think these are some of the weighty questions that we must address. Thank you.
A number of things. You know, somebody might just say a plethora of things. But I want to push back in my next round on maybe 3 areas that you've touched on. Maybe just your comments in the next round on how we are doing, you know, around the areas that you've listed. I like the way you know, point out that when you start thinking of regulation, you are thinking about limitations. So maybe in your view, you could then, you know, comment around what do we need to limit more and what could we open more when we come back. So interesting issues you raised there. But I want to come to the Deputy Commissioner. You know, you have a context of our digital space, and I'm not sure if, you know, as the UK government, what interventions, you know, are you currently probably supporting, you know, to ensure that there is a wider and a deeper penetration of the digital space, you know, that more can come online, you know, maybe supporting programs that bring more public schools online, as you noted, that challenge from a social and economic rights perspective. You know, some of the projects or initiatives that as a country, you know, you are looking at in, to ensure that, you know, there is more inclusivity and, you know, the digital space is deepened in Kenya and maybe elsewhere. Josephine, please.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's absolutely. There's you know really key issues, and it's you know because it's so easy to get you know look at all the opportunities with the sort of digital has given us, but as the last speaker said, if we look at it from the other perspective, there's also you know quite a lot of obstacles. So during the pandemic, we got involved in quite a wide range of projects. So one of them was you know looking at so working in some of the informal settlement areas, looking at creating sort of internet hotspots where people could access, you know, if they had a device, they could then access information, particularly public health information, through those hotspots. Was one thing. Another, I'm just thinking, there's been such a wide range of examples that we've been working on. We're also looking at sort of access to the sort of digital spectrum. That's quite a big piece of work at the moment. So looking at how we can use redundant channels in TV broadcasting, so known as TV white space. So and that was something we did specifically during the COVID area as well, creating partnerships using the internet, which providing internet connection to 25 health centres in Laikipia. And we have also been looking at kind of community-owned networks, is another sort of space we've been working in. Another thing we are sort of we're doing a bit of a study into is looking at the management and allocation of broadband internet spectrum to create universal access or open up access. So we're trying to better understand the overall benefits to the economy of having unlicensed spectrum, as opposed to the sort of more traditional approach of auctioning of spectrum to the highest bidder, which then translates into higher costs for the end consumer. So there's quite a wide range of very kind of specific work that we were doing also with vulnerable women, training them up to give them opportunities sort of to find jobs in the digital sector, to some of the kind of broader policy areas. There's so much that can be done. It's a world of opportunities.
Networks, and I have Josephine too, who has done quite a bit of work in this. I'm sure she would want to comment, and probably maybe after this, touch base with you on the kind of programs you are touching on around community networks and what she is working on around community networks and where you can leverage. But Josephine too, coming to you, we are talking about meaningful connectivity and having worked a lot with community networks. Why is this important, first of all, and how does it contribute to inclusion? And ultimately, what are your challenges today? Be they regulatory? What can you advise? How can we help? Deepen, such projects of community networks?
Thank you, Bob. Why it's important, it's we're living in an era where, as the conversation today has been from the last panel, is that we're living in a digital era. And especially with COVID, we've seen an acceleration in terms of moving into the online world, in education, as it's been mentioned, in health. And so it's no longer a luxury to get connected. It's actually a basic human need, and it's a basic human right that every Kenyan has access to the internet. But we see that there are some barriers that block people from getting access. We see issues around just access to infrastructure, as it's been mentioned. There are areas in Kenya that still do not have access even to 2G, or it's very minimal. And then when there are also issues around just the supporting infrastructure itself, where it's issues such as roads and electricity, which make it very difficult and very challenging to have regular internet access. And so in an era where we have so many unemployed youth, and we want to sort of push an agenda where people can become entrepreneurs, innovators, connect. If, for example, you're in Garissa, you can be able to sell your merchandise for people in Nairobi, and vice versa. There's really importance of ensuring that we have regular access to the internet, and it's not just the free bundles that we get, but really regular daily access to the internet that will enable people to access work, to access education, and also to access communication. And so for community networks, why we have this movement is because the reality is that there are areas that do not make business sense for commercial operators, or it might take longer for them to get there because it still may be very expensive for them to provide the service. And so we are working with communities to learn how to building their own infrastructure, and I'm so happy to see some representatives from the community network space, such as Twahir from Dunia Moja in Kilifi, as well as Irene Misoi from Planet Umoja, who working with communities who are building their own connectivity infrastructure. But this is not just about access to infrastructure, but it's sort of a holistic approach to digital inclusion, because they're also addressing issues such as content. They're also addressing issues such as skills, a lot of them you'll find that they work with schools, and so do work around digital literacy capacity building. In the line of community networks, I think because of how our regulations were framed, and I think it's just how it was envisioned before, it wasn't foreseen, I think, that communities will be able to build their own infrastructure, especially for non-commercial purposes. And so the regulatory frameworks, not just in Kenya, but mostly across the continent, have not been very supportive, I think, to both non-commercial operators as well as small-scale operators who are also provisioning at the last mile. And so because of this, it's issues around licensing, inclusive licensing frameworks. We're looking at also access to spectrum, which is very expensive. And so you find that in terms of building infrastructure, these networks are only limited to provisioning using Wi-Fi. And so what would be great is that, and I'm very happy that this year, together with Communications Authority, Kitanet, APC, with support from UK government, we worked on an inclusive licensing framework, licensing and shared spectrum framework for community networks, which has gone through public consultation and is now with CA. And this is just the beginning of opening up the space and saying that when it comes to digital inclusion, it should be all hands on deck, and let's open it up in a way that we are not just assuming that automatically communities would want to become consumers, but to become very active contributors in the digital space.
Thank you very much, Josephine. I see you are already somehow, linking with the UK government. So I think it is a discussion that is already synchronized. I want to come to Joel, and as you say, .ke is the gateway to the internet in Kenya. And looking at the infrastructure deficiencies, the last time I checked, I think our domain names at .ke are 100,000 thereabout. In your view, and as the custodian of .ke, what are some of the challenges that has probably slowed down the uptake of our brand as .ke, and what would be those interventions that probably as a registry you are working on, but those that maybe policymakers should take care of, so that there is more embrace about .ke, that more of us, the Kenyan community, get to know about .ke and they embrace it. What would be your comment around that, Joel?
Thank you, Bob. That's a very loaded question. I would need my own webinar for that. But just to reference what my two other colleagues have said, let's start with something that is very clear. This whole week, and I'll give a shout out to the Kenya School of Internet Governance, which had a 2-week excursion around what does the internet governance mean. And the first question we asked in that class, explain what the internet means to your grandmother. How hard is that to do today? How do you explain what the internet is? And a shout out to that cohort, because the answers that came have really enlightened even me, who's a custodian of the .ke. The team members who are on this call know how hard we struggle to answer that question. Secondly, we even asked, what does governance mean in your mother tongue? Again, another question. What I've realized in terms of uptake is, one, awareness about the internet is maybe localized to certain cities. Certain people don't care about it. They know about it, but they don't care about it, or they don't see the need for it in terms of their daily life today. Now, we've seen some numbers in terms of internet penetration, mobile penetration. Around the world, or sending money through M-Pesa. So what are those other things that people are doing? So one of the things we've realized, so we took a step back as a business and asked ourselves, the .ke namespace, it has to start with awareness. It has to start with, what does that mean? What does the internet mean for you? What does the internet do for you? How are you able to use that? So when I come and tell people for .ke, it's a network, it's a gateway, it allows you to get onto the internet, have an online presence. Okay, good. And then what next? So those are sort of like some of the challenges that we are seeing from our business perspective, and the cohort that was there unpacked a lot of those conversations in terms of how then do we ensure that that is happening. Josephine has mentioned something about content, local languages. The internet today is primarily English. How inclusive is that? How are we getting people to communicate on those platforms? How are people getting people to have more access to that? So as Kenny, we've now taken a back step and said, if we want to grow the domain space, we must be all inclusive. We must start asking ourselves, why are people using the internet? Why do they want to use the internet? Let me throw a number at you. I think there was a report that was launched on Monday by the Ajira team in conjunction with KEPSA, and I know there are some KEPSA members here. And it said 5% of Kenyan population is now earning online. 5% of Kenyan population is 2.3 million. And this is primarily the youth. And they are earning $188 a month, which equates to about 20,000 and a few shillings on. So there's an opportunity for people to actually earn online. But if we only have youth of 2.3 million, who are online, where are the rest? It means the rest are still doing physical work, and they are still doing things that they know today is best for them, which is opening a shop, taking a product and moving the product to the next person. So again, Bob, as to address your question around challenges, for us, what we are looking at is the laws adaptive enough to allow people to be more awareness of what they can do on the internet? Are they able to access the internet? Are they able to get more? Josephine has mentioned community-based networks, and one I know is Aheri, which is Mombasa in Kisumu, which is very active. They are now in the process of actually getting equipment to set people up. The cost of equipment is not cheap. So they're looking for partners that they can use to actually set up that equipment. I have seen some of the projects where they set up equipment, that ecosystem in terms of the market has actually changed. The vibrancy of the market has actually changed and people are able to earn. So as .ke and Kenny, we are saying, how do we assist that customer journey? How do we ensure that it's not just getting a domain name, but getting that online presence, able to use that online presence for some work or whatever you want to achieve with it. At the end of the day, you're able to earn a living and make some basic needs out of it. So we look at going forward, how does the regulatory environment encourage some of those things? How does the regulatory environment allow for more people to actually get access? So we have taken a step back as a business as ourselves. Let's create an awareness. Let's be able to ensure that people understand more of what the internet can do for you, how much it can help you, and thereafter you will see more adoption. So you mentioned that we have 100,000 domains. Kenya has about 3 million or so businesses, but we only have 100,000 domains. Do I argue and say it's a problem? Yes and no. One, my role is to ensure that, and I said at the very beginning, secure and accessible. So if there are more people on the internet, we are happy as Kenny. We want them to be on a .ke and the .ke domain, better for us. But if we have more people accessing the internet, being able to get reliable and accessible internet connection, you will see more people transition to be able to have more and more domain names. And at that, then our business can grow and the internet community can grow. So Bob, those would be my initial thoughts. But just in summary, awareness, accessibility. If we can get those two right, I think we're on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. I like the way you flip the question, about meaningful connectivity to making the internet meaningful to me. So when I go online, how does that help me? What can I get by going online? 5% of the youth, where are the rest? But a question to you as well, 100,000 domains, where are the rest? I think it's a journey, but interesting perspective that not only should we make the internet, should we not connect meaningfully, but we should ensure that that experience online is also meaningful to me as well. Mugambi, very quickly before I take a few questions from the rest of the participants, where we left about what can we open more, what should we close more, since regulations are essentially limitations. How are we doing along those areas, in your view?
Thanks, Bob. And actually, it's very, very interesting. I start with what now popularly called just stopped, which is that the internet is a human need. It actually is a human right. Now, if you talk about it being a human right, it's very, very clear how the limitation to rights work. And I invite panelists and everyone else to look at, for instance, the Syracuse principles on derogation of rights, but in our own constitution, Article 24, which talks about limitation of rights, the general principles is that to limit a right, it must be justifiable, it must be reasonable, and it must be justifiable in an open and democratic society, and it's based on dignity, equity, equality, and freedom. Now, that's a very broad area, and it comes to some of what perhaps Joel was talking about in terms of what is internet governance. My own response to that would be internet governance has to be anchored within a rights paradigm that does the following: that it guarantees the right to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, exchange of ideas, and guarantees questions of equality, equity, dignity. And based on that, then we can then say, if you're going to govern, then what are the things you're going to look at? And if you talk then about governance in the context of inclusion, you're going to be saying that it needs to be affordable. It needs to be available. The quality must be at a certain standard. There needs to be a capacity for people to use it. And I think that question has been raised, just in the sense that rural populations, much more than urban populations, are more liable not to have access just because of infrastructural concerns. And then the tougher questions around sanitation, hygiene within that space, because those do limit questions around who feels that it's a safe space for them, for example. And we find that various studies, I think in 2016, Article 19 did something about hate speech and abuse of women, especially women in the media. And the fact that then, for a lot of them, they'll be saying, I don't want to be part of this. In fact, our very own president has said he exited Twitter. I think it was Twitter that he said he doesn't go there anymore. So where is that principle of inclusivity for him? Because something is broken. And as I said, because this is really at the beginning of the curve, we should be a lot more forgiving of ourselves, that when we don't get it right, we try again. But foundationally, we use the principles. And Bob, to answer your question, start with the right. Then you can go to the regulation or the limitation. Always start with the right. Don't do it the opposite. The opposite side, the opposite is what used to be the old order. That you start by saying you don't speak. You only speak when. No. This one is you are allowed to speak, but then the limit of your speech is the beginning of the nose of your neighbor. Thank you.
Start with the right. Interesting. So, gentlemen and ladies, as we moved into our closing remarks because of our time, I want to give us each, 2 minutes to do two things. Comment on your priorities, 3 priorities, from where you sit in the next year, during this period. As you also answer certain specific questions that we have received. The first question is about community networks, and somebody is asking, of course, this will be to Melissa and Josephine Wan to touch on whether, if you implement community networks, does that in itself eliminate the digital divide? So 3 priorities from where you sit, Melissa, and also just comment on whether implementing community networks essentially eliminate the digital divide. 2 minutes for Melissa first, and then I'll move to Josephine 1.
Thank you, Bob. I think for me, the priorities, especially in the community networks space, would be capacity building so that communities can be able to build their own infrastructure, manage it and operate it, and also build their capacity to be able to address other components of digital exclusion, such as the skills gaps that we see, as well as content and capacities. Another one would be advocating for financing mechanisms for small-scale operators, especially community networks. Joel mentioned the Universal Service Access Fund, which I think would be one of the avenues that we can be able to support last-mile connectivity. And then also just engaging a lot with other stakeholders in the space. It's great to hear that, of course, Article 19, with Mugambi mentioning the working together to see how we can be able to create something on a framework on digital inclusion, really contextualizing it in Kenya. And also just saying, as I think the issues around digital access, there's no silver bullet, so it's a lot of listening to what other stakeholders are doing, and also what we can be able to contribute and collaborate to ensure that everyone is connected. And to answer the question, if community networks are the answer, I would say that, as I said, there's no silver bullet. It's a complementary model, but one thing I think I'm a strong advocate for is that as we are talking about access, we also need to look at the beyond access issues. So once people are connected, what next? We know of areas where, yes, infrastructure exists, but it's not being used. So we also need to address the other issues that, such as content, skills, as well as platforms, so that people can meaningfully engage online.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Melissa. Josephine 1.
Thank you. Yeah, no, for us, I suppose our digital access program is all about enhancing affordable, inclusive, safe, secure digital access for excluded populations. So our priorities really are continuing to work on inclusion, access to, particularly around access to basic services, to information opportunities, jobs, improving livelihood opportunities, and just spreading that. It's also about, I think, ensuring that there's kind of sustainable internet governance and digital rights, so that and linked to that, also making sure, sort of looking at cybersecurity, making sure that that all of this more inclusive access is an opportunity and doesn't pose threats or create new risks for people. Because obviously there's lots of positives, but we don't want this by spreading out improving the inclusion, that actually we're also increasing the threats. So I think those would be my top ones. On the question of community networks, I don't think it's not necessarily it's not the total solution. It's part of a bigger solution. I mean, obviously there's lots of very, very practical elements as well. There's devices, there's level of literacy, there's getting the right content. But I think all of these things have to work together to achieve that better inclusion.
It's not an end to itself. It's part of the ecosystem. Electricity, content, have to be right for that to really make sense. So, Joel, I would ask you to just tell us, what would be your priorities, 3 priorities in the next year, before I come to Mugambi, who I have, some 2 specific questions for. Joel, please.
Thank you, Bob. For us, priorities, 1, digital trust. So we want to drive the opportunity and the conversation that on the space, you're secure, you're safe. We want that to be on your .ke, so that is important for us. 2, priority is more accessibility and more openness. We want to be more transparent in what we do. We want people to understand how we do it, what we want to do, and how we're going to do that. 3 for us, and I'll combine if you guys allow me, is awareness, and I mentioned this earlier, just getting people more to understand when you get on the internet, what can you do, how can you do it, and what do you need to do. Obviously, because of KIGF, KICTANET, and all our multi-stakeholders, we need more partnerships and more collaboration. So those are focus areas as a business we shall be looking forward to: digital trust, accessibility and openness, awareness, partnerships, and collaborations to ensure that the internet is united. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Joel. And last but not least, Mugambi, I have some 2 specific questions coming from the floor. The first one, very important indeed. How can we ensure that people with disabilities are at par with everyone else in digital revolution? How do we ensure that they are not left behind? And someone is just asking that if you could please help them understand what Article 19 is about. They hear about it, they are struggling to make sense about it. In 2 minutes, if you could do that, I'll be very happy.
Actually, 3 tasks here. The 2 questions and my wrap up for the priorities. So I'll start with Article 19 is a freedom of expression organization. As I said, it's based on Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Essentially, because we're a partner with KICTANET, our contacts can be found here, and anyone who would like to know much more about us, can contact me or anyone on my team, find some of the work we're doing. Essentially, we use the human rights to animate and activate conversations about how to protect and promote human society, human needs, basic needs, and even questions around quality of life. Secondly, with questions around people with disabilities, I think we need to segment that space a lot better. We have people with visual disabilities, others with psychosocial disabilities, others with physical disabilities. All of them have specific needs based on, or in the context of access to the internet. I think for that, we will need definite thinking and programs that address those needs. The ones, for example, who have visual disabilities, the question is do we have the languages and the infrastructure available for them to actually access what's on the internet? Our very good friend for Article 19, former commissioner of the African Commission on Human Rights, Lawrence Mute, is actually blind, and yet he is able to access the internet. Is able to access information on the web pretty easily. But he's, as I said, is something that we need to look at and ask: can this be something that becomes universally accessible? So those are some of the ways in which people with disabilities perhaps can find support and facility from Article 19. I think these are very, very critical questions because they too have rights. And I think that's why I had ended my last presentation, that for us, in terms of also priorities, so the first of them, of course, would be to champion even more the question of rights within internet governance. I think we've been talking, regulatory frameworks, we've been talking limitations. It's time we talked rights as a foundation to limitations. I think that's the approach the Constitution takes. It's the approach that the international human rights frameworks take. And even if you look at questions, for example, of the Sustainable Development Goals, that is the approach they take: the rights first, and then limitations. I think I talked about greater collaboration. On the panel, I've had very interesting ideas. I'm really, really enthusiastic that there can be collaboration, greater collaboration, deeper collaboration with those stakeholders, state and non-state, around questions of rights and internet governance, questions of rights and access. Thirdly, I want perhaps to begin within that third priority to look at where are the people? Where are the people? Because when we talk about the internet, as someone said, you know, the internet is a gateway, it's a highway. Where are the people who are using it? And some of them would be, for example, in the education sector. How well are we doing on that? I know there was, you know, especially when there was there was the lockdowns and there was no education going on. I know those attempts to use the internet for education. How well did you do that? I think we need to really do audits about how are the people really doing when it comes to the internet, because we must use research and fact-based approaches to address the issues of access and inclusion. Thank you.
This very incisive session. I can't thank you enough, and I believe our audience has really benefited from your insights and your experience around these very critical issues that are part of the internet. So the internet is not just a commodity. The internet is a whole ecosystem, and in it there are lots and lots and lots of issues. The internet should be meaningful to us. And not just part of us. It has to make a meaning to us. So helping us discuss this session today has been my panelists, Josephine 1 and Josephine 2, and Joel from .ke or KENIC, who are the custodians of the .ke, and Mr. Kiai from Article 19. To our panelists and participants, thank you for being part of this session. I do hope that it has really, helped you understand, these elements of the internet and why the internet is important. And we do encourage you to follow up, should you have further questions with the individual panelists, or send them to us and really be part and parcel of the internet ecosystem. With that, thank you very much for being part of this session and for joining me during this 45 minutes, and wishing you the very best in the next sessions across the day. Thank you very much, and back to you.